All right, let's dive into some biology notes and textbook excerpts. We're going to break down some really important concepts in genetics and evolution in a way that, hopefully makes all stick with you. It'll be like having a personal tutor section, but way more fun, hopefully.
Exactly. We're not just going to, just spit back textbook definitions. We're going to connect the dots and, explore real-world applications and maybe even, bust a few common misconceptions along the way.
Okay, so let's start with the very basics, genes and alleles. You've heard about Mendel and his pea plants, right?
Of course.
But what's so cool is how his work, way back in the 19th century, laid the groundwork for things like genetic testing today, personalized medicine even. Pretty crazy to think about.
Absolutely. Mendel was the one who figured out that, different versions of a gene are called alleles and they determine our traits. Some alleles are, dominant, meaning they kind of overpower those recessive ones.
Right, right.
Think of it like this. If you have a gene for, say, eye color, and one allele codes for brown eyes and the other for blue eyes, you're going to end up with brown eyes because brown is dominant.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So you need 2 copies of that recessive allele to actually see that trait.
Exactly. And that's where those handy Punnett squares come in. They let us predict the probability of, say, offspring inheriting specific combinations of these alleles. And that's super important for understanding how, genetic disorders can get passed down through generations and families.
So we're not just talking about peas anymore.
No, not at all. We're talking about, understanding the blueprint of life itself. For example, knowing about dominant and recessive alleles, it helps us understand why some diseases, like cystic fibrosis, are more common in certain populations, right? It's all about tracking those genes.
Wow. Yeah. That's powerful stuff. But Mendel didn't stop there, did he? Didn't he also, figure out those 2 fundamental laws of heredity?
He did. There's the law of segregation, which explains how alleles separate during gamete formation, like sperm and egg cells, ensuring that each parent contributes only 1 allele per trait to their offspring.
Okay.
And then there's the law of independent assortment, which states that genes for different traits, they're inherited independently.
So, the gene for my hair color doesn't have anything to do with the gene for my height.
You got it. Think about it like shuffling 2 decks of cards. They get all mixed up, creating a ton of different combinations. This is why siblings can inherit different combos of traits from their parents, even though they share that same gene pool.
Oh, that actually explains a lot about my family. But it gets even more complex than that, right? What about incomplete dominance and codominance? I kind of remember those from my notes.
Ah, yes. Those are some fascinating curveballs, you could say, to Mendel's classic inheritance patterns. Incomplete dominance, it's like mixing paint colors. A red flower crossed with a white flower can actually give you a pink offspring.
Wow.
Because neither allele is fully dominant. They blend.
Okay, so it's not always a clear winner.
Exactly. And then you have codominance, where both alleles are expressed equally. So in some chicken breeds, if you cross a black-feathered chicken with a white-feathered chicken, you can get chicks with both black and white feathers.
That's really cool.
It's like each allele is shouting out its own instructions, and you end up with that kind of, patchwork of traits.
Okay, I see. All right, so we've talked about the basics of inheritance, but what about those traits that are linked to the sex chromosomes? Why is it that some things, like color blindness, are more common in men?
Well, that's because the genes for some traits are located on the X chromosome. And of course, that's one of the sex chromosomes, right? So males have 1 X and 1 Y chromosome, while females have 2 X's.
Okay.
So if a male inherits a recessive allele on his one and only X chromosome, he's going to express that trait. Females, on the other hand, have a backup X, so they need 2 copies of that recessive allele to show the trait.
Oh, so they're more likely to just be carriers of the trait, but not actually show it?
Exactly. It really highlights just how important those sex chromosomes are in inheritance, and why certain conditions just, disproportionately affect males. This is also a big reason why understanding family history is so important in genetics.
Yeah, it's like having this secret code hidden inside our cells. Okay, but let's zoom out a bit. Let's talk about how these inheritance principles play out on a larger scale. The world of evolution.
All right, perfect transition. Now we're moving from, individual organisms to looking at entire populations. Evolution is all about those changes happening in the gene pool of a population over time. And those changes, they often start with mutations in genes, the very things we've been talking about.
Wait, so those tiny little variations in our DNA are actually what drive the grand scheme of evolution?
You got it. And then natural selection plays a big role too. It's the idea that individuals with traits that are, better suited for their environment, they're more likely to survive, reproduce, and pass those advantageous traits down to their kids. It's like a giant filter kind of shaping populations over many generations.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see the bigger picture now. But natural selection isn't the only thing that's driving evolution, right?
You're right. There are other mechanisms like genetic drift. It's basically random chance influencing which alleles become more or less common in a population. This is especially important in smaller populations.
So it's not always about survival of the fittest. Sometimes it's just luck of the draw.
Exactly. Think of it like imagine a small group of beetles get, blown onto a new island because of a storm. They might not represent all the genetic diversity of their original population. Just by pure chance, certain traits might become more or less common in that new isolated population.
It's wild how random events can shape evolution.
It is. And then there's the bottleneck effect. That's when a population suddenly shrinks, maybe because of a natural disaster like a fire or a flood or a disease outbreak. This can dramatically reduce genetic diversity and have lasting effects on a population's evolutionary path.
It's like squeezing a whole population through a tiny little bottleneck. Only some traits make it through.
Right. And that loss of diversity can make populations more vulnerable to changes in their environment or to new diseases.
Okay, I'm definitely starting to see that evolution is much more complex than I thought.
Yeah.
It's not just, a straight line. But can we talk a little more about this idea of fitness? I feel like it's a term people throw around but don't always understand.
Oh, you're absolutely right. When we talk about fitness in evolution, we don't necessarily mean being the strongest or the fastest. It's about reproductive success. The organisms that produce more offspring, and those offspring survive to reproduce themselves, they are considered fitter.
So it's not about being a superhero. It's about passing on your genes.
Yes. And remember, what's fit in one environment might not be in another.
Okay, I'm getting a much clearer picture now. It's all about adaptation and change. That constant dance between genes and the environment.
Exactly. And those adaptations, they can be remarkable. They shape everything from a bird's beak to how well an insect is camouflaged.
I'm suddenly looking at nature in a whole new light. But before we go too far down the rabbit hole of evolution, can we talk about how different species interact? Like, what about symbiosis?
Symbiosis. This is where things get really interesting. It's where ecology meets evolution. It's all about the relationships between different species living together and how they affect one another's lives.
I remember learning about those different types of symbiotic relationships, like mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism.
You got it. Mutualism is a win-win. Both species benefit. The classic example is bees and flowers. The bees get nectar for food, and while they're doing that, they pollinate the flowers, which lets the flowers reproduce.
It's like they're working together. What about commensalism?
Commensalism is like a free ride for one species without harming the other. Think of those remora fish that attach themselves to sharks. They eat the scraps of food the shark leaves behind. The shark doesn't mind, and the remora gets a free meal and a ride.
That's pretty smart. And then there's parasitism, which isn't as friendly.
Right. Parasitism is when one species benefits, but it hurts the other, like tapeworms that live in the intestines of animals. The tapeworm gets a cozy home and food, but the host suffers.
Yeah, not so cozy for the host. But what's so interesting is how these relationships can actually lead to coevolution, where species adapt in response to each other over time.
Exactly. A good example is how some plants have developed really elaborate ways to attract specific pollinators, like bright, colorful flowers or strong scents. And then those pollinators, in turn, have evolved specialized mouth parts to get to those rewards.
It's like they're in this, delicate dance of adaptation, and it's shaping them both.
Exactly. Symbiosis shows us just how interconnected life really is.
Okay, so it's not always about competition. It's about collaboration, too.
Yeah.
All these relationships between different species.
Exactly. And those relationships are essential for ecosystems and for keeping that amazing biodiversity we see all around us.
Okay, wow. We've covered so much already, from Mendel's peas to evolution and even symbiosis. But now I'm ready for the big mystery, the ultimate question. How did life even begin on Earth? I mean, we're talking about billions of years ago, right?
Ah, yes, the origin of life. It's a huge question, a mind-boggling journey back to a very different Earth. But before we dive into that primordial soup, let's take a little break and let everyone, take a breather and process all this amazing info. We'll be back soon. Welcome back to our deep dive, everyone. Ready to jump back into that primordial soup and talk about the origins of life.
Definitely. I want to know how, those first life forms even came to be on a totally different Earth.
It really takes you back. I mean, back then the atmosphere was full of gases like methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and the oceans were basically this crazy mix of chemicals.
Sounds pretty intense.
Yeah.
So how did all that, basic stuff lead to the complexity of life as we know it?
Right. Well, one idea is abiogenesis, the idea that life kind of popped up from non-living matter through, a whole series of chemical reactions.
Wait, so from like chemicals to living cells, that's a pretty big jump.
It is. But there's this really cool experiment that gives us a clue. Back in the 50s, Stanley Miller and Harold Urey, they actually simulated the conditions of early Earth in a lab.
Oh, wow.
They combined those primordial gases, added some sparks to, imitate lightning, and what they found was pretty groundbreaking.
Okay, tell me.
They found amino acids, the building blocks of proteins just forming, spontaneously under those conditions.
Oh.
It was a huge sign that the ingredients for life, they could have just come from non-living matter.
Wow, so from like simple molecules to complex ones, that's crazy. But how did they go from those molecules to actual living cells?
That's where it gets a bit, more theoretical. One idea is that those molecules, they might have concentrated in like shallow pools or around volcanoes, places where they could interact and start to self-assemble.
So picture these like tiny little pockets of chemicals, almost like mini labs where life was coming together.
Exactly. And another cool idea is that RNA, not DNA, might have been the first genetic material.
Oh, interesting.
RNA is simpler than DNA, and it can do double duty. It can carry genetic information and help with chemical reactions.
So like a multitasker in those early cells.
Exactly. And then over time, DNA, which is more stable, evolved as the main way to store genetic info.
Wow. It's just mind-blowing to think about those simple self-replicating molecules as the ancestors of like everything alive today.
It really is. It shows you the power of evolution, and how everything is connected. Speaking of connections, we talked about inheritance and evolution, but how do scientists actually, organize all this diversity of life, all these different organisms?
Right. I remember learning about taxonomy, but it was always a mouthful. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species.
I know, right? Quite a hierarchy. But think of it as a giant family tree for all living things. Branches representing lineages that have split off over time, organisms with similar traits are grouped together.
So like all mammals have certain things in common that make them different from reptiles. And within mammals, primates share their own set of features.
Exactly. It's all about recognizing patterns and connections. We still use the Linnaean system with those familiar ranks today, but with new tools, especially in molecular biology, our understanding of those relationships is always evolving.
So we're constantly like updating and rearranging the tree of life.
Yeah, you could say that. Like, we used to have that five-kingdom system: animals, plants, fungi, protists, and bacteria. But now we've changed it to reflect, what we've learned. We have three domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya.
3 domains. That's a whole new level.
I know, right? This new system shows the fundamental differences between, prokaryotes like bacteria and archaea and eukaryotes like us.
So bacteria and archaea are both single-celled without a nucleus, but they have some key differences.
Exactly. And eukarya, that includes everything with more complex cells, cells that have a nucleus and other, membrane-bound organelles. This includes everything from protists to fungi, plants, and animals.
Okay, I see how that new system makes a lot more sense in terms of like showing how everything is related.
Exactly. It highlights the amazing diversity of life and, the fact that we're always trying to understand those connections.
Speaking of connections, what about food webs? They've always seemed so cool, seeing how energy flows through an ecosystem.
Food webs are fascinating. They really show interdependence. They illustrate how energy goes from producers, like plants, to consumers, like herbivores, and then to carnivores.
So it's like this. Plants capture energy from the sun, herbivores eat plants, and then carnivores eat the herbivores. It's like a chain reaction of energy.
Exactly. And don't forget about the decomposers, the bacteria and fungi. They break down dead things and waste, recycling those nutrients right back into the system.
So they're like nature's recyclers, making sure nothing is wasted.
You got it. Super important for keeping that balance. Without them, everything would just grind to a halt.
I'm starting to see how everything in an ecosystem is connected, from the smallest bacteria to, the top predator.
It's true. And those connections are what make ecosystems resilient. But they're also fragile. easily messed up by things like habitat loss, pollution, invasive species, things like that.
It makes you realize how crucial it is to protect that biodiversity, to keep
But
things in balance.
it does. Now let's switch gears a bit and talk about how we study those evolutionary relationships. How do scientists piece together the history of life when we're talking about things that happened millions, even billions of years ago?
Right. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with most of the pieces missing.
Totally. But we have some awesome tools to help. We've already mentioned fossils, those remnants of ancient life preserved in rock. They give us direct evidence of what lived back then. We can see those ancient ecosystems and track changes through time.
It's pretty amazing to hold a fossil and think about it being part of a living thing so long ago.
It is. And by studying them, we can learn about, their shape, their behavior, even the environment they lived in. Like, we're detectives putting together a story from these clues scattered across time.
Fossils are like windows into the past.
I love that. But fossils are just one tool. We also have the power of molecular biology, which lets us compare DNA sequences.
Right. The more similar the DNA, the more closely related two species are.
Exactly. It's like comparing blueprints.
Wow. So we're using DNA as a time machine.
Yeah. By comparing DNA, we can trace lineages and figure out, roughly when they split off from one another.
Exactly. And when you combine fossil evidence with molecular data, it creates this really, detailed and amazing picture of the history of life.
Like weaving together different threads of evidence.
That's a great way to put it. And that picture is, always getting clearer as we discover more.
This is all so fascinating, but there's one more thing I'm curious about. Speciation. How do new species even form? It's like the tree of life keeps branching out, creating these new lines. Speciation is where evolution gets really creative. It's how one species splits into two or more distinct species. And there are a few ways it can happen. One common one is geographic isolation.
So like when a population is divided by something like a mountain range or a river.
Exactly. When that happens, they're not interbreeding anymore, and over time, they can start to change genetically.
So each group is evolving on its own, adapting to its own little world.
That's it. And if those changes are big enough, those populations might become, reproductively isolated, meaning they can't interbreed and make fertile offspring anymore. That's when we say they're different species.
So even though they came from the same ancestor, they've changed so much that they're not compatible anymore.
Exactly. They're on different evolutionary paths, they become distinct species, but it's not always about geography. There's also sympatric speciation, where new species arise in the same area.
Wait, sympatric speciation? How's that even possible?
Well, it can happen a few ways, like through disruptive selection. That's where individuals with, more extreme traits have an advantage. Let's say you have a bird population, and some have large beaks and others have small beaks. If something changes in their food supply, those extreme beak sizes might be favored. Over time, the population could split into two separate species.
Wow, so even without physical barriers, populations can diverge and become like their own thing.
Exactly. It shows you how dynamic evolution is. New species are always popping up, adding to that incredible tapestry of life.
Okay, wow, we've gone from the origins of life to taxonomy, food webs, and even speciation. My brain is full.
That's great. And believe it or not, there's still so much more to explore. The world of biology is amazing. But let's give everyone a moment to, digest all this incredible information. We'll be back soon for the final part of our deep dive.
Okay, we're back, ready for the final stretch of our biology deep dive.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground, but before we wrap things up, are there, any specific groups of organisms we should take a closer look at?
I've always been fascinated by primates. I mean, we're part of that branch of the tree of life.
Primates are definitely a fascinating bunch. They've got this, unique set of characteristics that have allowed them to do well in all sorts of environments, from rainforests to, like, the savannah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember learning about, grasping hands, forward-facing eyes, and big brains as some of the key things that make primates. What's the evolutionary advantage of those traits?
Well, those grasping hands, especially with those opposable thumbs, they give primates amazing dexterity.
Mm-hmm.
They can manipulate objects really precisely, whether it's, picking fruit from a branch, using tools to get insects, or even, like in our case, building cities.
Yeah, it's incredible how one, seemingly simple adaptation can have such a huge impact. For sure. And those forward-facing eyes, they give primates excellent depth perception. Super important for navigating, a three-dimensional world. Judging distances accurately. Think
Yeah.
about it. crucial for those primates swinging through trees, but also for those on the ground, hunting or avoiding predators.
It's like having built-in binoculars and those large brains. That's what really sets primates apart cognitively, right?
Absolutely. Primates have relatively large brains for their body size, and that's allowed for, complex social structures, problem solving, and in the case of humans, language and abstract thought.
So basically, our primate ancestors played a big role in who we are today.
Absolutely. They gave us the, tools and the abilities to thrive in so many different environments and ultimately become the dominant species on this planet.
Wow, that's both like humbling and kind of awe-inspiring,
Mhm.
thinking about that long journey that brought us here. Okay, but before we wrap up, one last question. We've talked about how life is always changing and adapting, but what about the future? What are some of the big challenges and, maybe even opportunities that life on Earth is facing?
That's the million-dollar question. And a lot of scientists are thinking about that, every single day. I think one of the biggest challenges, hands down, is climate change. As temperatures rise and weather patterns get more extreme, ecosystems are being put under, immense pressure. A lot of species are struggling to keep up, and we're seeing, sadly, a loss of biodiversity.
It's heartbreaking to think about what we might lose.
I agree. But, there's always hope. Scientists are working really hard to understand these impacts and find ways to, at least lessen them. There's a big push for sustainability these days, focusing on cutting down those greenhouse gas emissions, protecting habitats, restoring ecosystems that have been
So
damaged.
there's still a chance for, a better future.
Definitely. Humans are incredibly resourceful and innovative. We have the knowledge and the tools, to make a difference. It's up to us to choose a path that benefits all life on Earth, not just us.
That's a great point to end on. Well, I think that wraps up our biology deep dive for today. It's been a whirlwind tour of, the vastness of life from its very beginnings to its incredible complexity.
It's been great exploring all this with you. Remember, biology is full of wonder and discovery. Keep asking those questions, keep exploring, keep being amazed by the world around you.
And that concludes our deep dive for today. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing with curiosity.